So the word we're kind of looking at for this Reformation Sunday is freedom. I was sitting there and I was thinking about that word, and if you ask someone, what's the definition of freedom, you might almost pause and catch on that for a second, right? Because it's so basic to our vocabulary. How do you even start to define it? Well, I looked up the Greek word for freedom that Jesus is using, that Paul uses, and it's a word that talks originally, like if you go back to its root, about being released from obligations that might be legal or civic or political or other types of obligations, and moral even, and of course, the Greeks loved politics. We probably love politics too, right? And so they really quickly associated this word with the political sense of it. And I thought, that's kind of what we do, is we hear the word freedom and we think of the kind of political element of it, and we love freedom. And so maybe the minute you hear the word freedom, what comes to your mind is the first thing that came into my mind. Braveheart, right? Big old yells, freedom. I don't even want to do it, all right? But yes, that scream of freedom. Or maybe you think, okay, quotes start coming to your mind. You think the American Revolution, Patrick Henry, give me freedom, or what? Oh, you guys didn't say that with much vim and vigor, but yes, okay. Or give me death, all right? But we start to think about those kinds of things with freedom. And the question becomes then, okay, so that's where our minds go. Where is Jesus' mind this morning? A couple of 1,000 years ago when he was preaching, and all the time in between, what are they talking about when they say the word freedom? When we start to think about freedom and freedom from sin, there's a certain inclination, there's a sinful side of us that hears, oh, I am freed from sin. God has forgiven me. He's given me 100% grace. And so if I am completely forgiven, no obligations, nothing on me anymore, then I'm freed not just from sin, but there's this little part of us that starts to think that I'm freed to what? Go sin some more, right? I just get to go do whatever I want. I can do whatever I want. That's where our sinful side starts to take us a little bit. Like, okay, you've forgiven me, now I'll go do more and more and more and more. And remember, Paul in the epistle is like, does that mean that you just go out and keep sinning? He's like, no, that's not the direction that I want to try to take you. But that was the accusation that came to Martin Luther 500 years ago in the Reformation, when he started preaching grace, and he's saying, oh man, I want people to understand that God completely forgives them. He's freed them from sin, death, and the devil, and they don't have to do anything to earn it. You know what, the Catholic Church, they said, well, good job, Martin Luther. Now people are just going to go out and they're going to live a life of sin. And they said that because they know that human inclination. And Martin Luther is like, that's not the plan. That's not what I'm trying to say, and that's not what Jesus, not what Paul was trying to say either. Our inclination is to say, okay, let's go live a life of no rules. And that's real. We see it in people around us all the time, right? And we felt that maybe that inclination inside us. I remember back when I was in high school, I was talking with a friend, and maybe I wasn't doing the greatest job of explaining grace and the Lutheran Reformation, but I was sitting there and trying to talk to him about my faith and how, oh man, it's so wonderful to know that your sins are forgiven. You don't have to do anything for it. And I'm trying to sit there and go through it. And he goes, so Dan, what you're telling me is that I can go and do whatever I want all my life, and then when I get on my deathbed, I'll just say, God, forgive me, and it's all gone, right? I'm like, well, kind of, but I think you're taking this the wrong direction. And he said, well, I'll maybe take it the way I want to. So what is true freedom? What was I maybe missing, part of what I was supposed to say to that kid back then? What was Martin Luther discovering? What was Jesus preaching? What was Paul teaching? Listen again to what Jesus said. Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits a sin is a slave to sin. The slave doesn't remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free. You see, the son wants to set us free, but he doesn't want to set us free to go out and sin more. He wants to set us free from sin, which is a slavery, not just in our past, but in the present as well. He says, I want to set you free not to go out and sin more so that you can get away from the sin finally. Now, the context is really, really helpful here. This is Jesus preaching in John chapter 8, okay, on the middle of the chapter. And so just a couple of little short sections before the beginning of the chapter is one of the most famous stories of Jesus interacting with a person that was stuck in sin. Do you remember the story of Jesus and the woman that was caught in adultery? Yeah, there's this woman that's grabbed by a bunch of Jewish leaders, and they drag her, and they're like, okay, we'll use her to trick Jesus. And so they bring her to Jesus to try to set up some kind of conundrum. And they say, hey, Jesus, we know what the law says, and the law says that this woman should be stoned to death. And they've all got rocks in their hands, right? They are ready to go carry it out. And they're like, Jesus, what do you think we should do now? And Jesus, remember, famously gets down in the dirt and starts writing something in the dirt, and people have lots of speculation about what he was writing. This isn't a sermon on that, so I'm not going to start speculating on that. The Bible doesn't even tell us. But what we do know is that after he writes in the dirt for a little while, he looks up at the people and he says, he who is without sin, what? Cast the first stone. And they all start thinking, and they drop their rocks and they leave. And Jesus looks at the woman. And he's like, it doesn't look like anyone else is going to cast any stones at you. Neither do I condemn you. Go out. He frees her from her sin, right? Now here's the important thing, right? The freedom from sin that he grants her, what does he say after that then? Does he say, go out and go back to that guy that you found before? Does he say, go out and find some new sins to just, have a high time? No. He says, go out and what? Sin no more. Jesus is telling her, you are free 100% from all the consequences of anything that happened before, and I love you and I forgive you, and I want you to know that my grace is there for you, and you don't have to do a thing to earn it, but you're not free so that you can go out and go back to that life that was bad for you. That was slavery. I am granting you real freedom. Go out and sin no more. That's the kind of freedom that Jesus was trying to teach about. That's the kind of freedom that Paul was picking up on. That's the kind of freedom that Martin Luther was trying to bring back to the church and to the world 500 years ago in the Reformation. I was sitting there and I was trying to think, okay, we bring that to today, and we start to think in terms of the metaphors that we have today. Sometimes it's bad to mix faith and politics, right? It's bad enough to talk about religion. People say, don't talk about religion. I'm going to talk about religion in church, right? And then they say, okay, well, don't talk about politics in church. Okay, well, just for the sake of a metaphor, maybe, all right? Because, I sit there and I think about, okay, freedom. A lot of times I think, okay, that's freedom from laws, freedom from government interference or whatever. But do we want complete freedom from those things? So I asked First Service this, and I was really shocked by the answer. How many of you have ever read Lord of the Flies? Man, it's just as bad in second service as first service. Not many people. They must not have that in the required curriculum anymore, okay? I'll have to talk to Corey Kath or something like that and be like, we got to bring this book back. Or at least bring it to Owatonna. Anyway, does everyone know the story of the book, roughly speaking? Maybe, maybe not. All right, it's the story of a bunch of boys, like English school boys, who end up shipwrecked on an island, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, there's no adults, right? Like literally, there's no adults there. We'll just do whatever we want, whatever we please, set up our own rules or lack of rules, and it goes poorly quickly, as you might imagine. It ends up with people like chasing one kid, and he's like chased off the cliff, and they're yelling his name, and he dies. I mean, it's bad, okay? Now that's an extreme example, a bunch of kids let to live however they please. But even as adults, sometimes we have this inclination, well, what would it look like if we could just be free from all interference of the government in our lives and just live by whatever rules we want to? Well, adults have tried it out before, right? In fact, there's an interesting example that I remember reading about a couple years ago, and I looked up an article on it again to make sure I kind of remember the details on it. It was a bunch of people who found each other on the internet, okay? And that's what people do, right? They find each other on the internet. And they were like finding each other around the idea like, hey, what would it be like if we could set up a community in the United States where we would just be free from almost all government interference in our lives? We don't want any rules. Now, there's going to be some rules, like there's going to be, like league laws that the nation has or the state has, but we want a community that has as few rules and regulations as possible. We want to be free. And so they picked New Hampshire, right, the live free state, and they found a community there that a bunch of them could come and they could kind of overwhelm it with numbers and vote whatever they kind of wanted through. And they did it, all right? And so they dismissed a police officer. That doesn't seem like a good first step, does it? But they did. They dismissed their police officer. There still would have been a sheriff in the county, all right? But then they started getting rid of every single rule in the book that they could possibly imagine. They're like zoning laws. Who needs zoning zoning laws. That is just the government interfering in my life. Get rid of all zoning laws, not some of the zoning laws, all of them, all right? And then they're like, wow, man, the government is sitting there and taking all my money to do these things I really don't need them to do. Any adult can deal with their own garbage. Let's go ahead and slash taxes and all those things and quit telling me where I should put my garbage. I can figure out my own thing with that, right? Okay, do you know where this goes? All right. Well, first off, do you think everyone is magically happier in this community? No, like civic complaints went through the roof. People were mad at each other all the time, and they had no one to help them arbiter some of those arguments, all right? And then not only that, as things got worse and worse and worse, and the conflicts rose, they had their first 2 murders there in that town ever in history. Now, that's very serious. On the it's still kind of serious, but almost more comical side, do you know what happens when you let people live wherever you want, including setting up campsites on a permanent basis in the woods? And then you tell them that they can throw their garbage wherever they want? Anyone predict what happens there? Bears. That's what happens. Okay? Someone before was like, flies. I'm like, flies was the least of their problems. Bears is what happens. Bears are like, oh, you were throwing food and you were putting it right next to your domicile. Let me come and check that out, and let me go in your domicile and see if there is some more. Yeah, they had their first bear attacks in over 100 years in that community as well. Safe to say, they're like, maybe we need to bring some of these rules back. You see, rules and law aren't always so bad, are they? But we're a people of extremes. We're like either no rules whatsoever, or then some people are like, oh, maybe it's all about more and more and more rules, right? And, okay, I think all right, you saw him. And so then you get the example of stuff that was going on, like when Jesus was first coming on the scene, and the people were like, you know what, God gives 10 commandments. 10 commandments aren't good enough. Let's have 613 rules by which we're going to try to follow things. I think some people think that's what the Christian life is like, right? People go to an extreme and say, okay, no, it's not just, freedom from sin. It's, man, if God's got some rules or laws in the Bible, let's find more and more and more and stack it up more and more and more. And not just Christians, but I think this is a lot of non-Christians' view of what Christian life looks like then, right? Is they're like, man, that life must just be all about following rule after rule after rule, and it looks boring, and it looks oppressive, and it looks like people who've sucked all the joy out of life. Man, I don't want to have anything to do with that Christian faith because it's boring and it's oppressive. And their vision of the Christian faith, to mix a political metaphor again, is like a totalitarian communist government or something like that, right? A group that comes in and tells you every single thing you should do and that you shouldn't do. Is that what Jesus is talking about then? I don't think so. In Scripture, he says, if you abide in my word and you are truly my disciples, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. The slave doesn't remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Does this sound like Jesus preaching to a bunch of people some kind of oppressive lifestyle where God is sitting there and like just pushing you down and squelching every bit of joy out of your life? I don't think so. It's being free and happy, living in God's freedom and according to his will. But there's an incredible amount of freedom in that. There's a lot of things that God kind of says it's completely up to you with, right? And that was part of what Martin Luther was trying to bring back in the Reformation as well, is that God gives an incredible freedom in life about all kinds of daily decisions. Martin Luther had this doctrine of vocation that he taught. He said, God doesn't tell you that some jobs are better than others or which job you should even do. He's like, I was a priest. I could have been a lawyer. It wouldn't have mattered to God. You can be a teacher. You can be an engineer. You can be a farmer. You can be a whatever you want. It's okay. God will find joy and worth for you in any and every single one of those things. God doesn't tell you what you need to eat today or what you need to wear today. Now, he may have some guidance on those things about things that are inappropriate, right? So if the kid comes up to me and says, okay, God says, I can be whatever I want to be a drug dealer. Probably not, right? Right? Or I can wear whatever I want to do. Well, there might be inappropriate clothes, right? But God gives us an incredible amount of freedom. And he says, live with that freedom along with my will guiding your life, and be happy about it. Be joyful in it. Feel free in it without the weight of sin that's bearing you down from the past or weighing you down in the present either. And he says it's actually a good thing and a joyful thing and a happy thing if you really listen to me and follow me. I'm not going to replace the old life with some boring, drab life. It's actually going to be joyful and amazing if you really look at it. I was sitting there and I was thinking this week about examples that I've seen of Christian freedom with Christian joy. And the people that came to my mind were actually my wife's grandparents, Edmund and Maybelle Broberg. All right, and what I loved about what I saw in them as I got to know them over the years was they were some of the happiest people that I've ever met. And they were some of the most devout followers of Jesus that I've ever met in my life. They lived a relatively simple life. I mean, they had things, but they really weren't worried that much about what things they had or didn't have. I don't think I ever saw them comparing themselves to other people and what those people had or did or anything like that. I mean, there were people who lived like pretty joyful, simple weekends when they were getting together with friends. There certainly wasn't drinking to excess. I don't think there was ever any drinking for that matter. And I mean, they played games, right? They're like, oh, what's a fun weekend? We get together with our friends and we make good food and we play games and we sing and we do music and we laugh. I don't know if I've ever met people who laughed more and smiled more than Edmund and Maybelle Broberg. And they weren't worried about all the things that people out in the world were like, this is what a fun weekend looks like. They're like, we got something better. And we love it. And we love Jesus and we know he loves us. That doesn't mean that they were perfect. They had plenty of sin in their life. I saw little bits and pieces of it, right? But they also knew God's grace and forgiveness for it. And they were happy in it. Christian freedom starts to look a little different when we start to avoid some of those extremes. And we embrace what it truly looks like in our life and what it can bring into our life. Sometimes it takes time to kind of get used to that and grab a hold of it. There's things that we leave behind in life that are hard, that are sticky, right? And then people may even have a hard time giving up. I remember early days and even all these years down the line, after a lot of work in 12-step recovery, you start to see new people come into recovery groups and they sit there and I mean, they just look oppressed, right? Like, oh my goodness, there's some kind of addiction or habit that's in their life and it's been oppressing them for so long. And you start to talk to them about giving it up and getting away from it. And they know they do, they want to, right? And so they want sobriety and it's so hard right away. They look like they're struggling every single day just to avoid that thing. And sometimes they look like, oh my goodness, it's so oppressive to try to get away from those things. And you tell them, hey, here's some of the things that you're going to have to do to get away from those things. And you might have to leave some old friends or some old relationships behind because those are the kinds of things that are going to suck you back into it, or some other side habits that are going to suck you back into it. And I mean, they just look like they're struggling day after day after day to stay sober. But you know what happens over time? You start to preach freedom to them and they start to realize, I do feel a little bit better now, day after day, when some of those things are behind me. And guess what? All of a sudden, new things start to come into life. New people and new relationships and new friends who don't like me because I did those bad things with them, but who like to celebrate freedom with me. And all of a sudden, we start to see a change from sober to recovered. And do you know what that difference is? It means that they're not acting out in their addiction and they're happy about it. They're joyful in it. And so we find that freedom from those habits in our lives and we're happy. That's the Christian view of freedom that Jesus was teaching about in John chapter 8, that Paul was preaching in Romans 6, and that 500 years ago, Martin Luther was trying to bring alive to the church again in the Reformation. And that's the vision we want to have here today. God knows all the junk in our past, all the sins that have weighed us down. And that's why Greg and I and this church is here to preach to you that you are forgiven by what Jesus Christ did on the cross, 100% freed from it without you having to do a thing to earn it now or ever. That doesn't mean that you're freed from it to go do more of it. You will, but you'll be freed from those things too. But not to go seek it out. You go from here forgiven from the shackles of slavery of sin, to go out and enjoy that freedom that God gives, following his will and being happy about it. Amen? Amen.